Getting more and more bedraggled the more I talk to you. These videos will probably end up with just me asleep on the pillow. But I was thinking of that person who overwhelms with their enthusiasm, and it made me think of something that I talk about on some of my multisensory training days, or when I talk about sensory stories, when I talk about multisensory rooms. There is an idea sometimes that the best pieces of equipment, because on those days I'll be talking about things, are the things that do it all, the thing that lights up and has an interesting texture and plays a song. Oh, maybe the video's led with just me running out of voice. I've been talking to people all day. I really should shut up. And what was it? Slow down, shut up and be curious. I'm doing the being curious. I'm not doing slowing down very well, and I'm not doing shutting up very well. I should take my own advice. But those things, you get them at trade shows. They're like, look at this amazing sensory thing. It does everything. It vibrates and it sings and it flashes. And for some people, they are really interesting. But those people tend to have really fast acting, acute sensory systems who can take in all that information. And I've met a lot of people with profound intellectual disabilities who live lives through very complicated brains. And sometimes it's not necessarily that they don't have capacity. Like, they might have eyes that see and ears that hear. It's just they don't necessarily have the processing capacity to take in all the information. So my eyes are bringing information to the brain, my ears are bringing information to the brain, but the brain only can cope with a certain amount of information. And once it's got that amount, either it doesn't take in any more, or if you give it more, it gets overwhelmed and can't handle it, and then it becomes a distress situation. So when I create my sensory stories, I always create them as monosensory, multisensory stories, in that at any one time I'm only asking you to do one sensory thing. Like, there'll be a sentence and there'll be one sensory modality that is supporting that sentence, and then there's another sentence and a different sensory modality is supporting that sentence. So they are multisensory in that by the end of the story you would have had lots of different sensory experiences, but in the telling they are monosensory. You're having them one at a time. And that's not me. I've said it in lots of different ways. I'm not saying that's the right way to tell sensory stories. I'm just saying that's the way I tell sensory stories, and I do that for a particular demographic. And the be curious thing, you've got to figure out, is this a good way for this person, or would it be better? For some people that would be really dull, and it would be much more interesting to have music that goes on with the touch that you're touching, and the smell that goes with the touch that you're touching, and to have all of it, to have that kind of immersive sensory experience would be better for some people. It's not a right or a wrong situation. It's a be curious. But the reason that I have so often looked for, the reason that I write these mono multisensory stories, is because I've met people who have capacity across modalities but can only use them one at a time. So if you've got, eyes that can see and ears that can hear and, fingers that can feel, but you can only do one of those things at once, your brain will pick to do the one it's best at, because it wants to have the most experience of the world. It wants to have the most information about what's going on, and it will generally be best at hearing. Not always, but most often when you're making a choice like that, it comes out as hearing. So you might see somebody touching something, and their kind of movement slows down when somebody starts to talk to them, because they were doing touching but then sound became available, so they switched to doing listening. I've quite often seen people be offered an object and they'll look at the object and then reach to touch it, and when they're touching it they'll look away from it, and it looks like they're not paying attention to it, but actually they've removed their vision from it so that they can feel it. When they saw it, they thought, oh, I wonder what that feels like. They reach out to feel it, and they need to take their vision away so that they can feel it. You can do both things, but you can't do them at the same time. And so if somebody is giving their all and being all singing, all dancing, and being super excited and active and moving and talking and all of this, sometimes that can take away from people's capacity to join in with the we keep being at a table moving our hands in paint. It's something that I spot in care homes as well. My I remember my grandma in her care home, and there was always a TV on in the background, and a TV is a really interesting sensory experience. My TV is on in the background here. It's really interesting if you have cognitive capacity to keep up with what's going on, which I'm not sure I do at the moment. If your eyesight is good enough that you can see the images moving, if your hearing is good enough that you can pick out what's being said. But if you haven't got those things, not only does it mean that you won't necessarily be interested in it. Like, a TV is a very bright object. If you're not picking out the details in that, it can just be like somebody shining a light at you. Interactive whiteboards are very bright objects. 4D immersive projection, there's a lot of lumens going on there. There's a lot of light. If you haven't got the visual skills to pick out the detail in that, it's just, spotlight in the face. Answer the questions. So not only does it not become an interesting sensory experience, it detracts from your ability to engage in other experiences. Because, to use vision as an example, seeing is the processing of light by the retina. And if I'm already having to process all that light over there from that television, I'm using up my visual processing on that light, and I have less of it to use to look at the object you're offering me. And so not only are we thinking about being curious about whether a monosensory presentation is going to be more useful to this person, whether this is a person who you want to do a kind of burst pause, or like a hi, and then a wait and a slow, and be curious and allow that turn. This is me falling asleep on you now. I'm losing train of thought. Processing of light. I know what it was. It's the background. It's not just about the object and the person doing it. It's what's going on behind you. Are you in a space that is accessible at a sensory level? If I'm in a really dark room and you offer me an object and you just spotlight it with a torch, I only have to do the processing of light for that one thing. It's a really, really easy way of seeing that object. Whereas I could hold that same object to you out in this room, which is lit, from multiple points. So you might be able to see the flashing TV light on my face. It's much harder to see the same object in this room because it hasn't got the plain visual background. And that's a plain visual background. You think of, what would a plain auditory background be like? And it's not just as simple as a quiet room, because a quiet room full of hard, shiny surfaces is a very different auditory background from a quiet room with lots of fabrics and cushioning around. You think about the quality of the background to the experience, and that changes your access to the experience itself. But you go through the other senses. What would be a plain olfactory backdrop, a plain smell backdrop? Is it just that you haven't sprayed any air fresheners, or is it that there's a window cracked and there's fresh air moving through? So thinking about the background to experience, I've gone on a sensory tangent because I'm a sensory bod. But the roaming around is back to the person who is going all out to engage, and actually the overdoing of it can be as exclusatory as not doing it at all.